Remember the Calgary Mustangs or the A16 Currie Army? You know, in my Remember the Calgary series, I always have to ask the question, as this is episode number 19, where I look at Calgary sports teams from the past. For this particular episode, we're going to be talking about some various Calgary hockey teams that existed during the Second World War in the Alberta Senior Hockey rinks, or in the what they called the Alberta Inter-Services League at the time. And for the title of this episode, it is more the RCAF Mustangs and the A16 Currie Army that I first found these teams. But there's actually a few more Calgary-based teams that I found after doing some research. And then the thumbnail that I had to use for this episode, because I couldn't find a good logo for any of these teams, was just the standard, the Royal Canadian Air Force, logo with the blue circle and the maple leaf. Because we're going to talk about hockey teams that were around during the Second World War. And for this particular episode, it was hard to find, some information. However, not in the sources that I usually find, because the hockey database, that's where I found these teams, and so I'll talk about it in this episode. But after doing some research, I found on these fandom sites that it got more in depth on some relics that I'll share at the end of the episode, like I do in many other episodes in my Remember the Calgary series, as well as some records and players that gone on to play in the NHL. So that's going to be a few teams that we'll talk about in this episode with kind of that same theme with the Second World War. So if you want to see my previous episode number 18 in the Remember the Calgary series, that episode I talked about the Buffaloes and Cowboys, mostly in the Alberta Junior Hockey League. And this time we'll stay in the rink, but we'll talk about some teams from the past during the Second World War era. So what obviously always inspired me to do this Remember the Calgary series before I get into my an episode is first, was taken in the Calgary Hitman Corral series during the 2018-19 season, where I looked at the Centennials, Wranglers, and Cowboys, which I've already made episodes talking about those teams that played in the Stampede Corral. However, these teams that we'll talk about actually played bulk of their games in what was the Victoria Arena, which was the arena that was around in Calgary prior to the Stampede Corral being built, which now is being slated for demolition for the expansion of the BMO Centre. And then, of course, the local clothing company, See a Dead Clothing, which I found on social media, and they're actually starting to get more around in the mainstream media. If you look on the other newspapers or the news, that they specialize in selling merchandise with logos from the past, and some teams that I've already talked about in the series and we'll talk about later in the series, as well as they put it on some landmarks on that, so you can check them out, as well as that Chris Wilson story where he shared his jersey collection. So I have all those links in the description below, as well as all the information that I found to talk about this episode and episodes in the past where I share relics and get my information to share to everyone. So that's what inspired me to do this Remember the Calgary series, and this is episode 19, and I did plan out 26 episodes, so at least we're in the final third. So let's dig right into this episode talking about, several hockey teams. On the hockey database website, it lists the teams as a first one, the Mustangs, the RCAF Mustangs, the Royal Canadian Air Force Mustangs. They were a senior amateur team that played 1944 and 1945. However, in the hockey database website, it doesn't say anything about a record, which is where I eventually tripped on those fandom sites. But all I have on here is that it was only that one season, in 1944-45, towards the end of the Second World War. And then it has the roster, and the roster mentions there was a Bob Brownridge, John Chad, Bill Dertel, Russ Dertel, I'm assuming they're brothers. Then there's Doug French, and then there's Ken Red Hunter, Arthur McCulloch, and Pete Slobodan. And then These players range from either being right here in Calgary to Provost, Alberta, to Elstow, Saskatchewan, Yorkton, Saskatchewan, Cameron, Alberta, or Dauphin, Manitoba. So that's all I have for the at least the RCF Mustangs from the Hockey Database website. However, when I get to the fandom sites, this is where I found a little more information. And then now the A16 Currie Army, once again, on the Hockey Database website, this team played from 1944 to 1945. However, on the fandom site, I actually found that they played a few more seasons, but it just says one season, 44-45, in the same senior league as the Mustangs and the A16 Currie Army played at the same time. There's a program that we'll have at the end of the episode, and then who was on this roster? Well, there was a Tommy Anderson, and actually listed he is from Edinburgh, Scotland. And then there was Joe Benoit from St. Albert. And then you have Max and Reg Bentley, let's say the brothers. I'll say it's safe to say because they both list them as from Delsey, Saskatchewan. And then there's a Lee Christensen from Junction City, OR. I'm assuming that means Oregon. And then there's Napoleon Bunny Dane, which that name I saw in the previous episode when he coached the Calgary Buffaloes. He's from Edmonton, Alberta. And then you got Dunk Grant from Aylesbury, Saskatchewan. And then you have Alex Cleta from Canmore, Alberta, which is just outside of Banff, west of Calgary. Then you got Doug Lane, who's from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. And then you got Ed McCalley, who is actually from Humboldt, Saskatchewan. And then it mentions that Ken Stewart, who is from Port Arthur, Ontario. So these are the players that on the hockey database that they found for the A16 Currie Army. And then, well, I'm not too sure, there's some kind of cross or communication on this one, but when I looked on the hockey database website for all the Calgary teams, and I figured, well, I might as well talk them all so I don't leave anyone out in my Remember the Calgary series. There was also a Victoria Army team that it says they played 1942, 1943 in the same senior league. But what's interesting is they mentioned it says Calgary in BC, which I'm not too sure if the team name was Calgary, but it says BC because we know that the capital of British Columbia on the island is Victoria. But then on the Hockey Database website, it shows an old program, which I'll share at the end of the video. It says Calgary's Victoria Arena. So that's definitely all I can find on this. Obviously, with the Hockey Database website, it doesn't mention any records, like in terms of wins or losses or whatever. But the all-time roster, well, there's only two players that they mentioned. There was a Rudy Dalsletis, doesn't mention where he's from. And then a Julian Sawchuk mentions he is from Calgary. And, sometimes with these teams going back to 75, 80 years, that it's hit or miss to find any information on. So, especially when we're talking about senior or junior leagues. So at least that's the hockey database part. So the fandom website, that it's all going to be in the description below. This is where I actually found even more information to elaborate on, to share a little more in this episode. And I still feel it was important to talk about these Calgary teams, especially given the time that they were playing, just to keep the memory alive and just another part of Calgary hockey and sports history. So first, the Alberta Inter-Services League. This was the league that took over the senior hockey in Alberta during the latter years of World War II. Because if you also go back to episode 15 where I talked about the Calgary Stampeders hockey team, this is kind of that same league where he competed for the Allan Cup. I guess it's spelled A-L-L-A-N, Cup. That the Cup wasn't awarded during the war, but this is kind of teams that competed during that time. They did not play and win the Allan Cup, but there was still some hockey competition. So from 1942-43 season through to the 1944-45 season, it was the only senior hockey league in the province. So this kind of maybe filled a void that might have been missed for hockey fans during this time. Canada did have conscription during those years, and many NHL players found themselves to be perform essential services jobs or military service. I keep in mind, back in these days, hockey players that played in the NHL weren't making millions of dollars and were the upper echelon when it comes to the economic class. So this is a time when NHL players were making just as much as the average folk, or even here in some cases even less. So this is definitely, got to show appreciation for that as well. That many of these players played in the NHL, also served in the military. And it mentions they also could not travel to the U.S., the United States. Some of these players end up playing for leagues such as which one towards close to their home games. And then they praised the level of hockey in this league, especially with a lot more NHL players. So this is kind of a filler league. So let's list of NHL players from all these teams. So first, this is the Currie Army, the A16 Currie Army. There was a Tom Anderson, a Joe Benoit, Max and Red Bentley. So those names kind of were reiterated from the hockey database website, but you can't get into deeper like how they did in NHL career. I think you have to look in the whole database. I know that with the NHL 100 celebration, I think the NHL really dug out and made sure they documented like absolutely every game and every stat. So I think you could look there for any of these players if you're interested. Then there was a Bob Carse, Bunny Dame, which mentioned that coach that coached the Calgary Buffaloes later. And then there's Don Deacon, Alex Chietta, Frank McCool, Stan Smith, and Ken Stewart. So those were the players that played in the NHL that were on this is the A16 Currie Army team. And now when it comes to the RCAF Mustangs, here are the more players. Pretty much were the same names that we saw on the hockey database that played in the NHL. You had John Adams, John Chad, Will Field, Hart McCallick, Peter Slobodan, Tiny Thompson, and Arch Wilder. So those are on the Calgary RCF Mustangs. And then while we're talking about the Alberta Inter-Services League, let's talk about the other Alberta teams, because there was a team based out of Lethbridge, the RCF Bombers for Lethbridge. There were 3 players that also played in the NHL. You had Garth Butch, Jake Milford, and then Peter Slobodan. So I think, Peter Slobodan, I'm assuming it's the same person that played for the Calgary and Lethbridge team. And then there was a Red Deer Army Wheelers team that a few players that played in the NHL that was in this league. There was a Mark Colville, Larry Kwong, George Prediger, Ed Slovinsky, and Jim Henry. And then there was one more Calgary team that actually discovered based on these fandom sites. Then there was the Calgary HMCS Tecumseh, which had 4 players that played in the NHL. You had Harold Brown, Jim Henry, Ed Slowinski, and Eddie Ware. So those are all the players on these teams that were played in the Alberta Inter-Services League that also were in the NHL at the time. So now when I went back to the hockey database website, it only said like 1 season, but the fandom sites had a few more teams, showed a few more seasons. Well, I mentioned that the champions of this league, well, 1942, 43, 43, 44, and 44, 45, actually the Calgary A16 Currie Army were the champions for those 3 seasons. So Calgary Currie Army were the best teams. And then the list of the teams, well, you had the Calgary Currie Army, the Calgary HMCS Tecumseh, the Calgary RCF Mustangs, and then they had the Lethbridge RCF Bombers and the Red Deer Army Wheelers. And then there's a few more old pictures that were part of a few teams. And then this article is part of the Allan Cup and other senior amateur competitions portal. So thanks to that for the hockey fandom. So that is the Alberta Inter-Services League. So it's very interesting how you start doing some research on a few things and it kind of leads you to another term we say, a rabbit hole, but this was actually very interesting. I didn't think it was going to be as long of an episode when I started doing my preliminary research, but it led me to this. It's like, well, got to put it in here for the video. So now for the team itself, you got the RCF Mustangs. They played in the Alberta Inter-Services League, and this one says 1942 to 43 to 44-45. They did not enter for the 43-44 season. They were a team put together from the Royal Canadian Air Force RCFF units are in and around Calgary. Their name Mustangs now reflected the fighter plane, but as well as the wild horses that are in the region, because there's been a few teams that have donned the Mustangs name. If you go back to episode 12, where it was a soccer team that donned that name, and then later in the series, there's still going to be another Alberta Junior Hockey League team that is going to use that name as well. Calgary naturally has horses around the area, plus, we're known for Western Heritage and hospitality. So then when it comes to the records, well, it said in 1942-43, this Calgary team in 23 games were 12-9-2 for 26 points. And it says they lost in the final in the playoffs. And then in 1944-45, it said in 16 games they were 9-6-1. It said lost in the final, so I think what it meant by, they were the best record in the league. That was first place in the division, because in the Alberta Senior playoffs, because there's a couple of records that you see on the website that it mentions how the team did in the league, but then in the playoffs it mentions that there's a standings where they said in 24 games for 1942-43. There was one that says the Alberta Currie Army were in 24 games they were 19-1-4. So there's a couple of records that I see on there as well. And then 1944-45 for the standings they were 16 games they were 13-2-1. So that's the I think that's the playoffs. I think that was the season in the playoffs, but I'm not too sure exactly where it says lost the final that I can find. That's where it's where it seems to not quite line up. But that's what I have for the RCF Mustangs. So now when it comes to the A16 Currie Army, it lines up now. It was the Currie Army that won the championship. Never mind. So the Calgary Army was named after the Currie Barracks at the Canadian Air Force's base in Calgary, which is right close to, if you're familiar with Calgary, there's the Mount Royal University. It's in, along Crowchild Trail. That's where the old Currie Barracks used to be. Actually, at one time, it was still the active Army base. When I went to, one of the schools I went to was Dr. Oakley in the area. It was an active base, but now the active base for Alberta is up in Edmonton. But I do remember that being one time that was a whole active Army base, which now that whole area has been redeveloped into a kind of a mostly residential commercial area, but that gives you an idea where it is in Calgary. And the Canadian Army base in Calgary, they played in the Alberta Inter-Services League from 1942-43 to 44-45, and they won every season. Okay, that's where it lines up. I'm going to say that the Mustangs had a better regular season, but not necessarily won the championship. In 1942-43, they lost to the semifinal in the 1942-43. They call it the Western Canada Allan Cup playoffs. Then 1943-44, the Canadian Army barred its name from playing the Allan Cup playoffs, and then they were none in the case in 1944-45. So they couldn't play in the playoffs. So in 1942-43, they were 19-4-1 in the standings, and then in 1943-44, in 16 games, they were 9-7. In 1944-45, they were 13-2-1. I already mentioned the teams the players that played in the I got my records messed up because I saw their individual and then the standings for the whole league. So the Currie Army was in first place, and then the Mustangs were in second place in many seasons during this time. So that is kind of the gist of the Calgary Currie Army, the A16 Currie Army. And now, if we bring up the Calgary HMCS Tecumseh, this team wasn't as strong compared to the Mustangs and the A16 Currie Army. It was named after the Royal Canadian Navy unit in Calgary, Alberta. It entered the league in the Alberta Inter-Services League in 1943-44 and 44-45. It did not enter the league. 1942-43, so in the first season, 1943-44, they were 8-8 in 16 games, and then in 1944-45, it was almost, thanks for coming out, in 16 games, they were 1-15. So this team wasn't as good compared to the Mustangs and the Currie Army. But in 1943-44, they were actually in second place in the standings 2 out of 3, because you had the Currie Army, they were 9-7, and then the Red Deer Army Wheelers were 7-9. So Calgary, actually all 3 teams got to play in the playoffs, but it was ultimately the Currie Army that won the finals in that league, and then in 19, let's see if they at least got to be into the playoffs in the last season. That they were 1-15 once it loads up, but I think they still got to play in the playoffs. No, they didn't. They did not make the playoffs that year because there was only 2 teams in that standings, and they were all based in Calgary. It was just the Army and the RCAF that played. So that is all we have for the various teams to talk about in episode 19. I couldn't find anything about, I got records when it comes to standings, when it comes to where each team finished where, but there's no records on what certain players did, like who led the team in scoring or what happened or anything outrageous. If you look deeper in those links, on each season it shows how the playoffs went, but I'm not going to go too deep into that as well. But what do you think was found interesting with these various Calgary teams? It's very interesting to know that there was some teams and players that played in the NHL that played on various teams that were in the Second World War. It filled a void during the time in the senior league ranks. But I gotta say, what team would you think was the most interesting? I mean, you had a team that was in the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, all at the same time, and it was only exclusively in Alberta. This was one of those researches that I just found a couple names and teams, and it kind of led to another. But I'll still share some relics at the end of the episode, as I usually do in my Remember the Calgary series. So now, if we look ahead to what I plan to talk about in episode number 20 before we close things out. In episode 20, we'll still stay in the rink, as we'll talk about a couple more junior hockey teams, the Calgary Rangers and Bronx. I got a couple more Calgary teams to talk about in the past as well, so it'll be interesting to see how it's going to plan out when I do research for that episode, which will be the next episode of my Remember the Calgary series. So I doubt any of you will remember any of these teams based on my analytics, that most people this would predate them. This definitely predates me, and even my grandparents, who would be either in their youth or in their teenager years, that they would have remembered these teams if they were still around for me to ask them today. So as I close out, as I say, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, and formerly, the A16 Currie Army, the Mustangs, and as the Tecumseh as well, the HMCS. So if that else, I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel. I also do a personal vlogs, attempt to comedy, and I also do share my experiences. Let's say I'm on the road at a sport event, so if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, you know what you need to do, just make sure you hit like, subscribe. I also have my other social media links down in the description below for other ways you can follow me and maybe give me updates on what I plan to do on my channel and whenever the next episode's going to be. A lot of the last couple of episodes, I didn't have a good enough quality graphic to put on Instagram to hype this next team. So I'll just, obviously, I usually put the thumbnail when I post the episode as well, when I put it up live. So as I say, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode or the next video. What do you happen to choose to watch my channel? So thank you.